Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. In Guatemala, after months of protests against government corruption, in particular case of siphoning millions of dollars from customs contracts, President Molina resigned on Thursday, citing that he needs to deal with his personal situation. A new interim government has already been sworn in. Apart from all of this, Guatemalans will be heading to the polls on Sunday for a general election. Now joining me to discuss all of this is Andrea Ixchíu. She is an indigenous Maya Quiche human rights activist and journalist from Guatemala. She works with the Guatemalan independent media outlet, Prensa Comunitaria. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, thanks for the space to talk about Guatemala's situation.
So, Andrea, describe the events that led to the resignation of the president.
Well, there has been many, especially because on April 25, the International Commission Against Impunity, CICIG, which has based in Guatemala since 2008, present along the general attorney investigation that implicates General Otto Pérez Molina, ex-president of Guatemala, that was involved in a corruption scandal, that he and part of his government were all part of a criminal structure named Line, which has been stealing the money for the incoming taxes and also for the incoming importations in Guatemala, and stolen the money from the migrations offices and also the duty.
Customs office, I understand.
Yes, customs office.
Now, I know that there's been massive protests, a big one culminating last week with hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating, calling for his resignation and the resignation of the government. But who was actually responsible for bringing this case forward and also forcing and putting so much pressure on him to resign?
Well, it is the investigation and the trial that the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala started along the attorney. That investigation was the one that bring him to a court. And it was also moved by the pressure of the protests and the demonstrations on the streets. But it's basically the investigation and the prosecution of the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala.
So the pressure that the people on the streets brought about, compiled with the investigation of the commission, this is a real example of democracy at work. Also, give us a sense of the former role that General Molina had played in the 36-year civil war that Guatemala experienced, and many organizations point to his role in the brutality in that civil war, but others credit him for actually being a negotiator and bringing about an end to the civil war. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can say that as a young indigenous woman, the part of the story that I already know is he's part of as being part of this criminal structure inside the military forces that committed the genocide against Mayan communities. We know that he is responsible for several massacres in the 80s, but also in his recent period as president in Guatemala, we have been living through another kind of criminalization, prosecution, and also new massacres against indigenous communities. In October the 4th of 2012, there was a massacre against my community in Totonicapan, Highlands, Guatemala, when thousands of people were blocking a road and protesting against new laws that the government of Otto Pérez Molina were trying to improve. So there's a lot of pressure and there's a lot of movement along Otto Pérez Molina resignation. The movements on the streets weren't being that huge if the indigenous and campesinos communities were not gone along together with the urban and middle class movement. And that's because indigenous communities has been struggling for these past 3 years that put Otto Perez Molina into a court because of the massacres committed in the 80s, because of the massacre that he committed in 2012. So there's a mixture of stuff. I can't say that he's a general of the peace or that his role in the negotiation were important, because now we see the facts that he was all the time part of this criminal structure named La Línea, and also he is also responsible for the human rights violations during the Civil War.
And now, is there any part of the legal process that's underway that's going to hold him accountable for any of that activity during the Civil War?
Well, when the genocide case was ended, we have a lot of people that, when they testified, they point at him. Also, there's another North American journalist, investigator, and also a part of a commission of journalists that came to Guatemala in the early 80s that has a lot of proofs about his participation in the massacres, as Alan Nairn, as you know. So they pointed at him. We have a lot of documentation. I'm not really sure right now if any community has already started a process against him because of the massacres in the 80s. But yes, there's a case open against his government because of the massacre in Totonicapán in October 2012. So we have seen that these military forces has always been, persecuting the indigenous communities, and Otto Perez Molina is part of this structure. So we can expect in the future that more cases against him can be opened.
And in the Sunday's elections coming up, Andrea, is there any hope in terms of the candidates that are running, and whether there is a more democratic government that could come into play?
In this moment and in this condition, there is no possibility that a democratic election can be done. We can see corrupt candidates from the parties that are leading this election. And we're really worried about that because we cannot find any possibility in the actual political parties to find alternatives, to have a choice to pick on Sunday. And that's why a lot of the civil society organizations are calling together along to do not participate in these elections. But also there's this big worry about the new president and the new government. None of the candidates that are now running for the presidency can give us any security that we can have good politicians and people that can lead the institutions in this crisis. That's why we're really worried about. We are expecting that the government, especially the Congress and also the Tribunal Supremo Electoral, which is the institution that leads the elections, can suspend the election on Sunday, because we have seen how political parties are putting threats against communities, pushing them to vote for them, also conditioning their participation for develop programs in communities. So that's not democracy. That's some sort of dictatorship. And that's what we do not want. And that's why also the mobilizations and demonstrations are marching on the streets, asking not just to change the political parties, we want to change the rules to make politics in Guatemala.
Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for the space to talk about Guatemala.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.